October 1944. The Moselle River sector, France. The momentum of the summer was gone. The glorious gasoline-fueled dash across France, where General George S. Patton's Third Army had sliced through the Wehrmacht like a hot knife through butter, had sputtered to a halt in the sucking mud of Lorraine. The enemy was no longer the disorganized rabble fleeing the Falaise pocket. They had reached the German borderlands, digging into terrain their grandfathers had defended in the previous war. The autumn rains had arrived with a vengeance, turning the fields into tank-swallowing swamps and the roads into slick ribbons of brown slime. The skies were a perpetual bruise of low, gray clouds, grounding the Thunderbolt fighter bombers that were Patton's aerial artillery. General Patton hated this kind of warfare. He hated the static line. He hated the mud. He hated the fact that General Eisenhower was diverting precious fuel supplies north to Montgomery, starving the Third Army just as it was ready to pierce the Reich. Patton paced the floor of his temporary headquarters in a damp, requisitioned chateau near Nancy. His polished cavalry boots were splattered with the omnipresent muck. He slapped his thigh with his riding crop, the sound like a pistol shot in the tense tactical operations center. "We are sitting here letting the Hun catch his breath." Patton growled at his chief of staff, General Hobart Hapke. His voice was high-pitched, almost squeaky when he was agitated, contrasting wildly with his bulldog appearance. "Every day we sit in this godforsaken goo, 1,000 more Germans dig 1,000 more holes. We must attack. We must maintain the violence of action." "General," Gay responded cautiously, pointing to the large situation map covered in grease pencil marks. "The 4th Armored is bogged down 5 miles west of the Moselle. The bridging equipment is stuck behind a convoy of deuce-and-a-halfs sunk to their axles. If we push General Wood's armor now, they'll be sitting ducks without infantry support." Patton glared at the map as if he could will the terrain to dry out. His eyes narrowed on a specific point on the map, a nexus of roads and high ground that dominated the approach to the Saar region. It was the ancient fortress town of St. Croix-de-Mont. St. Croix was a nasty piece of business. It sat on a rocky escarpment, surrounded by a natural moat formed by a tributary of the Moselle. It had been fortified by the Romans, expanded by medieval dukes, and modernized by Vauban in the 17th century. Now, the Wehrmacht had turned it into a hedgehog. Concrete pillboxes reinforced ancient stone walls. 88mm anti-tank guns were sighted down every approach road. It was the linchpin of the entire German defensive line in the sector. If Patton wanted to resume his drive into Germany, St. Croix-de-Mont had to fall. "Who commands the garrison there?" Patton demanded. General Gay flipped through an intelligence dossier. "We believe it's General Oberst, Colonel General Friedrich von Kessel. Old Prussian aristocracy. Fought in the First World War. He's not a Nazi fanatic, sir, but he is a rigid disciplinarian. Intelligence suggests he has about 3,000 effective troops, a mix of hardened Eastern Front veterans and some Volkssturm replacements. But they have excellent artillery support from the ridge lines behind the town." Patton snorted. "A Prussian junker. Good. They understand war. They know when they are beaten." He tapped the map violently with his crop. "I want to bypass it if he can. Surround it and let it rot." "He tried, General. The terrain funnels everything right under von Kessel's guns. The lead elements of combat command took heavy fire this morning trying to skirt the northern flank. Lost 4 Shermans in 10 minutes. Von Kessel has that valley zeroed in." Patton clenched his jaw. The veins in his temples throbbed. He felt the familiar pressure building, the desperate, burning need to move forward. He saw warfare not just as strategy, but as a clash of wills, a spiritual contest where the commander who faltered first lost everything. "Then we don't bypass it," Patton declared, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "We go right down its throat. Tell Wood to prepare a full assault. I want every piece of core artillery raining hell on that rock until the rubble bounces. We're going to smash that Prussian bastard. Inside the fortress, 5 miles east, inside the thick granite walls of St. Croix-de-Mont, General Oberst Friedrich von Kessel stood in the observation slit of the main citadel tower. He was a tall man, gaunt, with the dueling scars of his university days marring a stony face. He wore his greatcoat collar turned up against the damp chill. He held Zeiss binoculars to his eyes, watching the distant smoke rising from the valley floor where his 88s had ambushed the American tanks earlier that morning. "They are probing the northern approaches again, Herr General Oberst," said his aide, Major Weber. Von Kessel lowered the binoculars. "Yeah, that is Patton. He is impatient. He tries to run before he can walk in this mud. It is his greatest strength and his greatest weakness." Von Kessel knew his situation was hopeless. He knew the war was lost. The news from the east was catastrophic. The Red Army was annihilating Army Group Center. In the west, the sheer material superiority of the Americans was overwhelming. But von Kessel was not fighting for Hitler. He despised the Bohemian corporal and the Nazi party thugs who had ruined the honorable profession of arms. He was fighting because it was his duty. He was fighting for the professional pride of the German officer corps. He had been ordered to hold St. Croix to buy time for the Siegfried Line to be reinforced. He would hold it. "What is the status of the ammunition stocks for the Pak 43s? Von Kessel asked. "Low, sir. We have perhaps enough for 2 days of sustained combat. The supply columns from Saarbrücken have been strafed incessantly by the Jabos whenever the weather clears." Von Kessel nodded grimly. "Then we must make every shot count. Tell the gun crews. No firing until you see the white stars on their hulls clearly. We will draw them into the kill sacks." He walked away from the slit and looked at a large medieval tapestry hanging on the damp stone wall, depicting a knight besieged in a castle. "Major Weber, do you know why this fortress has never fallen in assault for 300 years? Because of the cliffs, sir? Because the defenders knew there was nowhere else to go," Von Kessel said softly. "We are surrounded. Patton will not let us escape, and I have no intention of running. We will make this rock a very expensive piece of real estate for the Americans." The assault begins. 48 hours later, the sky briefly cleared. Patton seized the moment. He unleashed the full fury of the XX Corps artillery. For 4 hours, 155mm long toms and 105mm howitzers hammered St. Croix-du-Mont. The sound was apocalyptic. From his forward command post, Patton watched through binoculars as the ancient town disappeared under a shroud of gray and black smoke. Dust plumes rose hundreds of feet into the air as centuries-old masonry crumbled under high explosive impacts. "That's the music!" Patton shouted over the din, grinning fiercely. He loved the symphony of destruction. "Keep playing it. Don't let them lift their heads." As the barrage lifted, the tanks of the 4th Armored Division roared forward, their engines screaming as they churned through the muddy approach roads, followed by infantrymen clad in wet olive drab, hunched low against the expected return fire. They hit the minefields first. Lead Sherman tanks blew their tracks, slewing sideways and blocking the narrow paths. Then, von Kessel's trap sprung. From camouflage bunkers set into the cliff face, the high-velocity German anti-tank guns opened fire. The cracked thump of the 88s echoed across the valley. American tanks began to burn, thick pillars of oily black smoke joining the gray dust over the battlefield. The American infantry were pinned down by murderous MG-42 machine gun fire that swept the open ground like a scythe. The assault stalled within 20 minutes. At his command post, Patton listened to the frantic radio traffic. The lead battalion commander was screaming for smoke for air support. "For God's sake, get the artillery back on the cliffs." Patton's face darkened to a dangerous shade of crimson. He grabbed the radio handset from the operator. "This is Patton. What in the hell are you stopping for? I don't care if it's raining Tiger tanks. You keep moving. You push those hulks off the road, and you drive over them. Attack! Attack!" Despite his fury, the reality on the ground was undeniable. The lead regiment was being chewed to pieces. To continue the frontal assault without softening up those hidden bunkers was suicide. Reluctantly, raging against the necessity, Patton ordered a temporary halt to reorganize. The first round had gone to the Prussian. The ultimatum. That evening, the rain returned, soaking the dead and the living on the slopes below St. Croix. Patton sat in his caravan, brooding. The casualties were high. Too high. He needed that town, but he couldn't afford to wreck his best armored division taking it against such fanatical resistance. He needed to break the enemy's will. He called for his intelligence officer, Colonel Koch. Koch, this von Kessel, is he a reasonable man? Is he a fanatic? He's a professional general. Very proud. Not SS. He's old school Wehrmacht. Patton nodded slowly. Pride. That's the lever. Patton decided on a gamble. He would offer the German an honorable way out. He respected a hard fight, and von Kessel had given him one. Send a message under a white flag, Patton ordered. Draft it formally. Tell General von Kessel that he has fought aggressively and brilliantly. Tell him his position is hopeless. He is surrounded by superior forces. To continue to resist is a useless waste of German life. Demand his immediate, unconditional surrender. Tell him if he surrenders now, he and his men will be treated with all the honors of war due to a brave adversary. The message was typed up, translated into German, and carried by a brave major and a sergeant waving a large white sheet tied to a rifle. They walked out into the no-man's land between the burning American tanks and the silent German bunkers. Patton waited. The entire staff waited. The silence in the HQ was heavier than the artillery barrage had been. Patton sat perfectly still, his ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist, staring at the canvas wall. He believed in reincarnation. He believed he had fought at Carthage, at Rome, at Waterloo. He felt the weight of those past lives now, the eternal confrontation between the conqueror and the defiant defender. 2 hours later, the mud-caked American major returned. He looked shaken. He saluted Patton smarty. "Well," Patton demanded, leaping from his chair, "is the bastard packing his bags?" The major swallowed hard. "No, sir." "What did he say?" "Give it to me exactly." The major stood rigid. "Sir, we were taken blindfolded into the citadel. General von Kessel met us. He was very polite. He read your message. He acknowledged that you were a great commander." "Get to the point, Major." "Yes, General. He said that while he appreciates your estimation of his defense, his orders are to hold St. Croix until relieved or until he has fired his last round. He said his honor as a German officer forbids surrender while he still has the means to resist." The major paused, taking a breath before delivering the final blow. "And then, sir, he looked me right in the eye and said, 'Tell General Patton that if he wants St. Croix du Mont, he will have to kill me to get it.'" The operations tent went deathly silent. Everyone looked at Patton. They expected an explosion, the famous screaming profanity that could peel paint off a Jeep. Instead, a terrifying calm descended over George Patton. He stopped moving. His high-colored face went pale, making his intense blue eyes burn even brighter. A small, chilling smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He looked at the map of the fortress town, the place where hundreds of his boys were lying dead in the mud. "He wants me to kill him," Patton whispered, almost to himself. The tone made the hair on the back of General Gay's neck stand up. Patton slowly pulled on his white leather gloves. "All right," Patton said softly. "If that's what the son of a bitch wants, we shall oblige him." October 14th, 1944. 0500 hours. The hills overlooking St. Croix. General George S. Patton did not sleep. Sleep was for men who didn't have a fortress to crush. He stood in the pre-dawn darkness, the collar of his B-3 bomber jacket turned up against the biting wind. He was smoking a cigar, the ember glowing like a malevolent eye in the gloom. Behind him, the entire Exec Corps artillery was assembled. Not just a few batteries, but everything they had dragged through the mud. 155mm long toms, 8-inch howitzers, and the terrifying 240mm Black Dragon siege guns. He had gathered his commanders an hour earlier. His instructions had been simple, brutal, and devoid of mercy. "Von Kessel wants to be a martyr," Patton had told them, his voice rasping like a file on steel. "He thinks this is a Wagner opera. He thinks he can sit in his stone tower and bleed us dry. I want you to erase that thought from his mind. I want you to erase the tower. I want you to erase the rock it stands on." He turned to his artillery chief. "Don't just suppress them. Bury them. I want time on target. Every shell lands at the exact same second. I want the concussion to liquefy their bowels before the shrapnel even hits them. Now, Patton checked his watch. The second hand swept past the 12. Play the music, Patton whispered. The hammer falls. Inside the fortress, General Oberst von Kessel was drinking a cup of ersatz coffee, staring at a map of the valley. It had been quiet for 6 hours. Too quiet. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a rumble, it was a shriek. The air pressure in the room dropped instantly as hundreds of heavy shells displaced the atmosphere above the citadel. Von Kessel didn't have time to dive. Crack-doom. The impact was singular. Hundreds of tons of high explosives detonated simultaneously across the fortress complex. The massive stone walls of the citadel, which had withstood medieval catapults and 17th century cannons, shuddered like a dying animal. Dust and pulverized mortar blasted through the viewing slits, blinding von Kessel. The coffee cup disintegrated in his hand. The floor heaved, throwing him against the map table. Outside, the world had turned to fire. The 240mm shells, weighing 360 pounds each, smashed through the roofs of the bunkers. Concrete pillboxes were cracked open like eggshells. The men inside turned to pink mist by the overpressure. The flak towers guarding the approaches were swatted aside, twisting metal raining down into the courtyard. For 30 minutes, the barrage did not let up. It was a drumroll of annihilation. Von Kessel crawled across the floor, blood trickling from his ears. He grabbed the field telephone. The line was dead. He staggered to the door and looked out into the corridor. It was filled with choking gray dust. Wounded men were screaming, but he couldn't hear them over the roar of the incoming ordnance. Patton wasn't attacking. He was excavating the ghost flank. While the fortress was being pounded into gravel, something else was happening in the woods to the east. Something von Kessel had gambled was impossible. The terrain to the east of St. Croix was a steep, heavily wooded ravine called the Wolfsschlucht, Wolf's Gorge. It was considered impassable for armor. The slopes were 45 degrees, the mud was knee-deep, and the trees were dense. Von Kessel had placed only a skeleton crew of machine gunners there, confident that no tank could navigate it. He forgot who he was fighting. Colonel Wild Bill Sterling, commanding a task force of the 4th Armored Division, stood in the turret of his lead Sherman tank, Cobra King. General Patton says go. Sterling radioed to his column. He says if the tanks slide, let him slide. If they throw a track, fix it and catch up. But we're going up that gorge. The Shermans roared into the ravine. It was a nightmare. Tanks slipped sideways, crashing into ancient oaks. Engines overheated as they redlined, trying to claw up the muddy slopes. Men jumped out with chainsaws and axes, hacking a path through the timber while mortar shells popped blindly around them. It was madness. It was suicide. It was classic Patton. By 800 hours, they broke the tree line. They were now on the plateau behind St. Croix-de-Mont. They were looking down at the undefended rear gate of the fortress. Target acquired. Sterling radioed back to HQ. We are in their backyard. The wash is hanging on the line. The chemical terror. Back at the front, the artillery lifted. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in the ears of the survivors. Von Kessel stumbled out of the ruined command bunker. He looked at his defenses. They were shattered. The northern wall was a pile of rubble. The 88mm gun emplacements were smoking craters. But the Prussians were hard men. Stand to, von Kessel roared, his voice cracking. They will come now. Manning the walls. MG-42S to the breach. The survivors, dazed, bleeding, covered in gray dust, dragged themselves to their positions. They set up their machine guns in the rubble. They checked their grenades. They were ready to die. But Patton didn't send infantry. Not yet. He sent the Zippos. Sherman tanks modified with M1A1 flamethrowers rolled out of the smoke. They didn't fire solid shot. They trundled up to the bunker slits, protected by the suppression fire of the infantry behind them. Von Kessel watched in horror from the upper citadel. No, he whispered. The tanks unleashed streams of thickened, burning napalm. The liquid fire sprayed into the bunkers, sticking to walls, weapons, and men. It sucked the oxygen out of the air. Screams, Terrible, high-pitched, inhuman screams echoed up the hill. German soldiers, engulfed in flames, ran from the pillboxes, only to be cut down by American riflemen. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. Patton was systematically burning the infection out of the rock. "This is not war," Major Weber gasped, standing beside von Kessel. "This is slaughter. It is the price of refusal," von Kessel said, his face a mask of tragedy. He drew his Luger. "We have lost the outer perimeter. Pull everyone back to the citadel. We hold the keep." The constriction. By noon, the American forces had entered the lower town. The fighting devolved into a brutal, close-quarters brawl. Combat Command, a push from the north. Colonel Sterling's task force pushed from the east. The jaws were closing. Patton moved his command post forward, setting up on a ridge just a mile from the town. He watched through his high-powered binoculars. He could see the tiny figures of his men moving through the burning streets. He saw a Sherman tank take a Panzerfaust hit and explode. He flinched, but didn't look away. "General," an aide ran up. Message from von Kessel. Patton lowered the glasses. "Another one? He's broadcasting on the open frequency, sir." "In the clear." "Read it." The aide read from the notepad. "To General Patton, you have destroyed my town. You have burned my men. But the citadel stands. I'm still here. Come and get me." Patton threw his head back and laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "I'm beginning to like this guy," Patton said. "He's got balls. Big Prussian brass ones." Patton turned to General Gay. "He wants a duel. He thinks this is the Middle Ages. He thinks if he holds the high tower, he wins the day." Patton looked at the sky. The clouds were thick, low, and heavy with rain. Air support was impossible. The citadel walls were too thick for tank guns. The only way in was through the heavy oak gates, which were barricaded and covered by sniper fire. "Give me the 155s, Patton ordered. "I want them brought forward. Direct fire." "Sir." Gay looked shocked. "Direct fire with 155 millimeters howitzers? At that range? They'll be exposed to small arms." "I don't care," Patton snapped. "Wheel them up the street. Point them at the front door. And knock it down." The doorstep. The battle for the inner courtyard was savage. The Americans dragged the massive 155 millimeters long tom guns through the rubble-choked streets of the lower town. German snipers picked off the crews. American infantry returned fire, storming the buildings overlooking the square to clear the windows. It took 3 hours of blood and sweat to position the gun. Von Kessel watched from the slit in the heavy oak gates of the citadel. He saw the monster gun being leveled at him from 200 yards away. The muzzle looked like a tunnel. "Get everyone to the cellar," von Kessel ordered. "Move." He stayed. He stood by the gate, watching the American gun crew load the 95-pound shell. He watched them ram the powder bags. He watched the lanyard being pulled tight. He checked his uniform. He straightened his iron cross. Boom! The shell hit the gates at nearly point-blank range. The explosion didn't just open the gates, it vaporized them. Splinters the size of spears flew across the courtyard. The concussion killed the 2 guards standing nearest the entrance instantly. Von Kessel was thrown backward, skidding across the cobblestones. He hit the stone fountain in the center of the courtyard, the breath driven from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, staring at the gray sky. Ash and snowflakes were falling together. He heard the roar of engines. Through the smoking hole where the gates had been, a Sherman tank, Cobra King, crunched over the debris. Its 76 millimeters gun traversed the courtyard, looking for targets. Behind it, a squad of muddy, hardened GIs poured in, their M1 Garens leveled. Von Kessel groaned and sat up. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, broken by the impact. His greatcoat was torn. He was covered in the dust of his destroyed command. He looked around. His remaining men, perhaps 50 of them, were emerging from the cellars and the keep, hands raised. They were done. They had endured the artillery, the napalm, and the siege. Their will was broken, but von Kessel's was not. He stood up. It was an agonizing effort. He swayed, his boots slipping on the wet cobblestones. The American soldiers shouted at him. "Drop it! Hands up! Hände hoch!" The Sherman tank commanded the center of the yard. The hatch opened. A helmeted American colonel, Sterling, popped up, aiming a .50 caliber machine gun at von Kessel. "It's over, General," Sterling shouted. "Look around you. It's finished." Von Kessel looked. He saw his fortress in ruins. He saw his men surrendering. He saw the American flag being unfurled on the lower ramparts. He looked at the American colonel. "I told General Patton," von Kessel shouted, his voice surprisingly strong, echoing off the ruined walls. "I told him the price." Von Kessel reached for his holster with his good hand. "Don't do it," Sterling yelled. "Don't be a fool." Von Kessel didn't draw the gun to surrender it. He drew it, clicked the safety off, and raised it toward the tank. He wasn't trying to hit the tank. He was forcing the reaction. Suicide by enemy fire. But before he could pull the trigger, a jeep roared through the shattered gate, skidding to a halt behind the infantry. A man jumped out. He was wearing high-polished cavalry boots, miraculously clean, riding breeches, and a helmet with 3 stars. He carried a riding crop. "Hold fire," the man screamed. His voice cracked like a whip. "God damn it. Hold your fire." It was Patton. He had come to collect the bill personally. Patton marched past the stunned infantryman. He walked right past the barrel of the Sherman tank. He walked into the open, standing 20 feet from the German general who was pointing a Luger at him. The silence was absolute. The rain began to fall again, washing the dust from the stones. Patton stood with his hands on his hips. He looked at the Luger. He looked at von Kessel. "You said I'd have to kill you," Patton said, his voice conversational, carrying easily in the quiet courtyard. Von Kessel's hand wavered slightly. "I'm a man of my word, General." "So am I," Patton replied. "I blew your walls down. I burned your bunkers. I killed 1,000 of your men. I have paid the price of admission." Patton took a step closer. The American soldiers tensed, fingers whitening on triggers. "But I don't kill brave men for sport," Patton said softly. "And I don't let brave men kill themselves out of vanity." Patton stared into von Kessel's eyes. It was a contest of pure will. The blue eyes of the American against the gray eyes of the Prussian. "You fought a hell of a fight, Fritz," Patton said. "Maybe the best defense I've seen since Sicily. But look at your men." Patton pointed with his crop to the huddled, terrified German survivors. "They need a commander to lead them into captivity with dignity. If you die now, you take the easy way out. You leave them alone." Von Kessel looked at his men. He saw their fear. He saw their exhaustion. He looked back at Patton. He saw not a conqueror, but a warrior who understood the code. Von Kessel's arm began to shake. The Luger felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Drop it," Patton ordered. Not a scream, but a command. Von Kessel closed his eyes. He opened his hand. Clatter. The Luger hit the cobblestones. Von Kessel slumped, his legs giving way. He fell to his knees, head bowed. The resistance of St. Croix-du-Mont was over. Patton walked over. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap. He handed it to the kneeling German. "Drink," Patton said. "It's bourbon. Real Kentucky bourbon. It'll put the fire back in your belly." Von Kessel looked up. He took the flask with a trembling hand. He took a long pull. He coughed, then breathed deeply. "Thank you, General," Von Kessel whispered. "Don't thank me," Patton grunted, turning away to bark orders at his staff. "Get him to a medic. Fix that arm. Then get him to my mess tent. I want to know how the hell he sighted those 88s on the ridge." Patton walked back to his jeep, stepping over the debris of the gate he had destroyed. He looked up at the ruined tower. He had won, but he knew, deep down, that the war wasn't over. And the next time, the next commander might not be a man of honor. As the jeep drove away, Patton looked at the map. "Next stop," he muttered. The Rhine. October 14th, 1944. 2,100 hours. Patton's forward headquarters. The rain lashed against the canvas of the large mess tent, but inside, it was warm. A generator hummed nearby, powering electric lights that cast a yellow glow over a surreal scene. At the head of a long table covered with a white linen tablecloth, requisitioned from a local hotel, sat General George S. Patton. He was immaculate. He had changed his uniform, his boots shone like mirrors, and he was eating his steak. To his right sat General Oberst Friedrich von Kessel. The German commander looked different. His arm was in a sling. His face was washed, but the exhaustion was etched deep into his bones. He was still wearing his field gray uniform, stripped of his pistol belt, but allowed to keep his iron cross. Around them, Patton staff officers ate in silence, glancing nervously at the enemy general. It was a violation of protocol to dine with a prisoner, but Patton didn't care about protocol. He cared about warriors. The steak is tough, Patton complained, sawing at the meat. But the wine is excellent. À 38 Bordeaux. I liberated it myself. Von Kessel took a sip of the wine. It is excellent, General. Better than the ersatz coffee we have been drinking for a month. Patton put down his fork. He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. Now that we are fed, Friedrich, tell me. The Northern Ridge. My air recon said you had 4 batteries of 88s up there. But when we hit the main gate, they didn't fire? Why? Von Kessel smiled, a thin, tired smile. Because, General, I had no shells. The table went silent. What? Patton asked. My supply lines were cut 3 days ago, Von Kessel admitted. The barrage you faced on the first day? That was everything. When you sent the ultimatum, and I told you that you would have to kill me, I had exactly 7 rounds left for the main guns, and 12 bullets for my pistol. Patton stared at him. Then he started to chuckle. The chuckle turned into a roar of laughter. He slapped the table, making the silverware jump. You bluffed me, Patton howled. You magnificent bastard. You held off the Third Army with an empty gun and a bad attitude. A soldier fights with what he has, Von Kessel said quietly. When the ammunition runs out, he fights with his reputation. I knew you respected strength. If I had surrendered easily, you would have thought me weak. But because I threatened you, you paused. You brought up the heavy artillery. You bought me 12 more hours. 12 hours for what? Patton asked, narrowing his eyes. What did you gain? Time for the hospital train to leave the station in the valley below, Von Kessel said. 300 wounded men. They crossed the Rhine at noon today, while you were pounding my empty bunkers. Patton stopped laughing. He looked at the German with a new level of respect. This wasn't just stubbornness. It was a calculated sacrifice. You traded your fortress for your wounded, Patton said softly. A fair trade, I think. Patton raised his glass. To the professional. Von Kessel raised his. To the victor. The prophecy. The dinner ended. The MPs arrived to take Von Kessel to the rear, to the POW cages, and eventually a camp in Mississippi. Before he left, Von Kessel turned to Patton. The atmosphere in the tent shifted. The camaraderie of the soldier vanished, replaced by the cold reality of geopolitics. General Patton, Von Kessel said, you have beaten us. The war is lost for Germany. We know this. You should have known it when you invaded Poland, Patton grunted. Perhaps, but a word of warning from one cavalryman to another. Von Kessel walked to the map on the wall. He pointed to the east, to the red arrows marking the Soviet advance. We are the dam, Von Kessel said. We are holding back the flood. When you destroy us, the dam breaks. You think you are liberating Europe? You are merely changing the jailer. The Russians are not like you and me. They do not drink wine with their prisoners. They do not honor flags. Patton's face darkened. This was the fear that kept him awake at night. The fear that he was fighting the wrong enemy. I can handle the Russians, Patton growled. I'll kick their ass into the Volga if Ike lets me. I hope so, Von Kessel said sadly. Because if you don't, then we have all died for nothing. He saluted. A sharp, crisp Wehrmacht salute. Patton returned it. Von Kessel turned and walked out into the rain, disappearing into the night and into history. The end of the warrior. Patton never forgot Sainte-Croix-du-Mont. He often told the story of the Prussian who bluffed the Third Army. But the prophecy haunted him. Months later, the war ended. The Nazis surrendered. But as Von Kessel predicted, the peace was cold. The Russians occupied Berlin. The Iron Curtain descended. Patton, designated as the military governor of Bavaria, became increasingly vocal. He wanted to rearm the Germans. He wanted to push east. He sounded exactly like Von Kessel that night in the tent. We fought the wrong enemy, Patton wrote in his diary. But fate, or perhaps the weary world, had had enough of George Patton. December 1945. A gray, misty day in Mannheim. A Cadillac limousine. A collision with a truck. The general who had survived shrapnel, machine gun fire, and the mud of Lorraine lay broken in a hospital bed in Heidelberg. He died on December 21st. The warrior died in peacetime, paralyzed, his battles finished. Epilogue, 1955. Luxembourg. 10 years later. The Ham American Cemetery. It was a crisp autumn day, much like the day St. Croix fell. The leaves were turning gold and red. A civilian car pulled up to the gates. An old man got out. He walked with a cane, his left arm stiff, an old injury that never quite healed right. Friedrich von Kessel walked through the rows of white crosses. There were 5,076 of them. He reached the grave at the head of the formation. It stood alone, facing the troops. George S. Patton, Jr. General, 3rd Army. Von Kessel stood there for a long time. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was a businessman now, helping to rebuild the shattered industry of the Ruhr. But in his mind, he was back in the courtyard, watching the smoke clear, holding a Luger he didn't intend to fire. He remembered the flask of bourbon. He remembered the handshake. He reached into his coat pocket. He didn't have a flask, but he had a small bottle of schnapps. He poured a little onto the grass in front of the cross. "You were right about the tank tactics," von Kessel whispered to the grave. "And I was right about the Russians." He looked at the white cross. "They say you were a difficult man," von Kessel said softly. "They say you were crazy. But you were the last of us, George. The last night." Von Kessel straightened up. He ignored the pain in his arm. He stood at attention, discarding the cane for a moment. He snapped a salute to his enemy, his friend, his conqueror. "Sleep well," he whispered. "The war is over." He picked up his cane and walked away, leaving the general alone with his army, under the silent, peaceful sky of Europe. The end.